He said we're going to have a free exchange of views.
Yes.
So I guess it should begin. Just a couple of points. I mean, I agree that maybe this thing shouldn't be entirely about Islam. There are other issues associated with how secular humanists should talk about religion, I think. But to respond to a couple of points, the treatment of women, I mean, I think, you know, we would probably more or less agree on what we find reprehensible. One thing I have heard, you know, more and more women in the Muslim world have been wearing the veil who weren't before, or at least some form of headdress. Sometimes it's actually the women who choose to do so. Sometimes they do it under coercion. But what I've heard from people who have really are concerned about this and are really out in the field is that in both cases, one of the most common causes is their perception that their culture is under threat from the West and is disrespected. And that reminds me of something that I meant to say, maybe I haven't underscored, is that, you know, as for the issue of kind of proselytizing, of kind of atheist proselytizing, to the extent that it's directed at Muslims, or almost anybody, certainly any fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, anyone, I think it's just going to backfire. I mean, you know, as I had said, I think that what brings the worst part of religion out is when people perceive themselves to be in a zero-sum game with somebody, and that includes perceiving a sense of threat. And you know,
let me just ask you a question there. So, one thing I sense in you, we actually haven't covered this topic before, but I sense in you a double standard that I notice in many people who are leery of criticizing religion, and it's counterproductive, it's insensitive, it's who are we to say that this entire culture that we're confronting that's oriented itself very differently is wrong.
That's not what I said. That I did not. I
okay, well,
did not.
Okay, well
say.
then maybe then it's. But well, again, this is a question. How would you differentiate what the everything I've said negatively of Islam from a similar critique of what's going on in North Korea? I view North Korea as a hostage crisis. I view Afghanistan under the Taliban as a hostage crisis. Now, I never get pushback when I criticize North Korea and the poverty of information there that is enforced on the population, and the fact that many of them believe that they're a master race. They believe Kim Jong-il has got magic powers, and when he was born, spring, you know, spontaneously occurred. And I mean, it's a religion. It's not a religion that anyone feels that they need to be tactful about. It's obviously a horrible situation. Why can't you view? Let's make it very simple. The truly extreme situations under Islam as analogous to North Korea. Do you view them that way? Is there a difference that I need to be I need to walk on eggshells around?
I had never thought about the analogy. I mean, just thinking about it now, I would say. I
mean, do we have to be tactful? We're worried about North Korea, but can't we just talk freely about how bad that situation is?
In the case of North Korea, I don't see tactlessness having a big downside as a practical matter.
Well, it certainly pisses them off. I mean, it's not as it pisses Kim Jong-il off.
And what are they going to do?
Well, but my point is there seems to be, you were expressing a kind of, well, there's the pragmatic issue, which is it counterproductive to say what you think is true? That's a conversation we can have. But what I'm getting from you, and I've gotten it from many people, is that it's in bad taste. It's a failure of compassion to actually connect with the strivings and how difficult life is for people. I mean, they have these. Their religion is the focus of their lives, and they didn't go to Ivy League schools. I mean, you kind of dropped in a little places where I should have my guilt and scruples peaked there.
Did it work? Do you feel guilty? Did that work?
No. But how does it map onto North Korea? I mean, it seems to me that it's a pretty straight analogy, and everyone, I think, to Everyone I meet knows that North Korea is just, if we could wave a magic wand and change that situation, we would be monsters not to do it. And if we could wave a magic wand and change much of the Muslim world, I'm saying we would be monsters not to do it.
If you could wave the magic wand. Unfortunately,
the
wand
that,
you're waving, I think, has exactly the opposite effect.
Okay, no, that's the pragmatic conversation. But if you concede that if you could wave the magic wand, then you're conceding the same, you're acknowledging the same scope of the problem, and now we're just talking about how to solve it.
Well, no, I mean, I don't like the phrase the Muslim world even. There's so much variation throughout the Muslim world. But if you ask me if I could wave a magic wand and end oppression everywhere it exists, and end needlessly cruel punishment everywhere it exists, and end the ruthless suppression of freedom of speech everywhere it exists, yes, I would.
Okay, but you wouldn't end,
what works?
But that is not the only question, because
what's the other?
Well, and again, I mean, you and I have been sort of pitted to debate one another, and frankly, you and I probably agree about so much about the way the world works and how human beings should live that, you know, this is probably better conceived of as a conversation rather than a debate. But there's, you in your attack upon the new atheists have echoed a lot of criticism we've received that there's something, one, there actually isn't a conflict between religion and science, as witnessed by the fact that there are many scientists who are religious. Okay, and this is something that Chris Mooney has done a lot, and I mean, I'm sorry I missed the panels on that, but you know, Francis Collins is an existence proof of the fact that there is no conflict between religion and science.
I've certainly never said that.
Okay,
I think he's completely confused.
Well, great. Well, then I won't hold you accountable to that argument. But there is a sense that, and I think you and I would probably agree, there's more to life than just understanding the world scientifically, clearly. And people need to find some way to be happy in this world. They need to find, there are many obvious virtues that people think they're getting from religion, and they are getting them from religion. I mean, they're getting community because they go to church. They are feeling positive mental states of devotion and love. They have they set aside a Sabbath. But the question for me is, it's not even a question. The obvious fact for me is that we could easily do those things without these terrifying liabilities and these divisive doctrines that have just shattered our world into these separate moral communities. And the question is, what is the way forward? And there are enough people pretending there's no problem with religion. That's my concern. There are enough people who seem to be asleep at the wheel, who are just think that we're going to wake up 100 years from now and rapture-ready Christians and martyr-addled Muslims are going to be living happily side by side in a world with 10 billion people and unimaginably destructive technology. It seems nearly impossible to imagine that that's a likely outcome. So if we just want to talk pragmatics, that's fine. But I kind of hear circulating in your remarks that you're saying that one, religion is actually not the problem that I'm claiming that it is, that people are not motivated by these beliefs, and that the history of Islam is truly benign and we're exaggerating it.
I didn't say that. There's not any religion, any major religion that has a benign history. Jains, I haven't done the study. I mean, I will say that the closer you look at religions, the less great probably all of them look, at least at certain moments. I mean, I was recently at a conference where I was singing the praises of Buddhist meditation, and one thing you and I have in common is respect for that tradition. You're better at meditating than I am. And I was saying, and I was talking about how transformed my worldview was after a meditation retreat. And this eminent anthropologist and sociologist who's been all over the world said, I'll tell you, I've lived in a lot of Buddhist societies. They spend, about as much time killing each other and other people as anybody else. And I said, well, but remember, in most Buddhist societies in Asia, the lay people don't actually meditate. They don't practice Buddhism in the sense that we mean it. It's just more conventional religion. He said, no, the monks too. They're always killing people. So I don't know. I mean, maybe he's exaggerating, but I think I don't deny there are differences between religions, but you know, Christianity is manifestly capable of atrocity on as large a scale as any other religion.
Let me just ask you, I promise I won't filibuster. You take, again, it's most illuminating to focus on specific beliefs. So you take the concern about gay marriage in this society. Okay. Now, we have a president who's against gay marriage. I mean, the only statement I've ever heard him make on it is that his faith tells him it's not kosher. Although that's not a direct quote. So his faith tells him not to support gay marriage. Now that, in our culture now, 2010, that's the only argument you need, right? And that appears to me to be a problem. I mean, unless you are obliged to argue that gay marriage is actually going to create immense human suffering or foreclose a future of great happiness, you have no ethical argument. Given the deference we pay to faith, the burden is never upon someone to make an actual ethical argument in situations like that. So my question to you is, one, are you actually doubting that faith is the engine of those kinds of concerns? Or do you actually think that no one who's against gay marriage is actually against it based on the ideology of their faith? They just have this sort of visceral disgust of when they imagine gay sex, and it's by accident that so many of them seem to be Christians?
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that nobody is, but I would predict that in 20 years there will be gay marriage in America. Pretty much everyone will be on board, including almost all the Christians, and that'll be a tribute to the
hold on. But let me just ask you about that. To who will what will get the credit at that moment? Okay, so what you will want to say, I think, and what many meliorists and accommodationists will want to say is that, see, religion can change. Religion has sort of internal resources that are moderating, and it's got sort of this wisdom that, lo and behold, you know, in the year 2075, the Catholic Church
I won't say that. I guarantee you I won't say that, because I don't think religion has any vaster reservoirs of wisdom than pretty much anybody else.
No, but will you admit that change is coming from the outside?
Have you been keeping track? Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Every once in a while. My view, just to clarify, my view is that religion is virtually a neutral medium. Okay, it's not good, it's not bad, it's like nationalism. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. So I don't have this kind of really flattering view of religion that you seem to think I have. And just to get, you know, on the issue you raised of pragmatics, you know, again, I think. You know, you seem to be asking me what's the way forward. Well, I actually have some ideas about that if you're interested, but I really think the ball is kind of in your court on this, because I think it is one of the things most manifestly the case about fundamentalism is that walking up to fundamentalists and telling them that their God doesn't exist only makes them more deeply fundamentalist. And, you know, so do you disagree with it? I mean, what is your plan is what I want to know. I mean, here's the irony I see of the new atheism. I can see that, you know, if you put billboards on buses about, you know, about God not existing and stuff, I can actually see that having some effect. And I actually think, I think the new atheism has probably had some real effect in getting some people who kind of had been Christians or subscribed to some other faith to kind of say, you know, really, I'm an atheist. But those are the people who weren't the problem. The people who are the problem are going to tend to have exactly the opposite reaction to the proselytizing, in my experience. So
I think that's we should be cautious about how we extrapolate from our experience in that way. I don't know, frankly, what the effect is of publicly expressing these ideas. I can tell you that I get emails by the hundreds and thousands from people who were born in a faith community, many of them in fundamentalists, who lost their faith by some process of reasoning, by some confrontation with books like Richard's or mine or Hitchens, or with some uncompromising stance that they found indigestible cognitively and emotionally. And I had dinner with a woman who had lost her faith that day based on reading my book. Now, that's not the normal occurrence. I mean, people rarely change their mind in real time and give you credit for it. And I certainly don't expect that to happen in this conversation.
But I mean, I'm just guessing this is not a woman who was poised to murder an abortion doctor before she could. She was just probably a woman who wouldn't have been a problem either way, is what I'm saying.
No, but you're just talking about the religion. I mean, Baptists are not, Catholic, in this case, Catholics are not, murdering abortion doctors. There are jihadists who have ceased to be jihadists, who have become atheists. It's possible to change people's minds. Now, if it weren't, we'd be doomed. And we know, even if it's not possible to change an adult's mind, we know it's possible to change the next generation's mind because they have no beliefs to speak of. So if we had an education system, if we had an educational system that just presented a truly uncompromising stance in terms of its commitment to present a rational worldview to children, this would be politically a very difficult thing to engineer in this society. But there's no telling how quickly we could get rid of this problem. I mean, the Bible could be taught like the myths of Mount Olympus in a single generation. And if we can't sort of visualize that possible future, I don't know what.
I agree that if minds can't be changed, we're doomed. If the jihadist mind can't be changed, we're doomed. But it's actually not necessary that they become atheists. It's just necessary that they become not jihadists. So the question is how do you minimize the number of jihadists in future generations? We disagree on that, and maybe we should leave it there.
There's a truly inconvenient fact there, which is that religious people always, of necessity, have recourse to the books. That's the only recourse. And the books don't get edited. They can't get edited. The books tell you they can't get edited. So every Muslim, we could just hit the pause button on the human experiment for 100 years, and we would all wake up, we'd see the books, and if you want to be Muslim, you have to consult the Quran and the Hadith. And they're not going to change. So we have to find some way of editing these books, at least by encouraging people not to attend to the more stringent passages.
The interpretation constantly changes, and it does in Islam as well, as a practical matter.
Within limits so narrow as to be profoundly uninteresting in an era of potential nuclear terrorism.
Well, again, a few decades ago, jihad just wasn't an issue. That's a pretty narrow time frame.
That's not true. First of all, you're extrapolating from a vast period of history where the Muslim world was insular, and you had true areas of Muslim domination where, of course, within a thoroughly Muslim society, there are no infidels to fight. And we've only gotten this technology whereby very few people can destroy whole societies very recently. And so the game has changed.
And we disagree over how to minimize the number of people in future generations who want to deploy the technology, and I think our disagreement is pretty clear. You brought up, maybe we should talk about education a little, which you brought up.
Yeah.
And I don't know. My feelings in this area are not as firm. I do know people who think that the new atheists are making life hard for the people, say, in Kansas who are fighting to get Darwin into the curriculum. And I actually had a conversation with it gives me a chance to plug my website, Blogging Heads TV. I was doing a dialogue with this guy, and I won't name him. I mean, he's a very prominent scientist. I guess that's as specifically as I should identify him. But he said, after the dialogue, that's why I can't identify him, he said, off the record presumably, that he knew I was going to do this thing. Now, he said the new atheists have really complicated life for him because he used to be able to reason with religious people, and now their attitude is, you know, we're just the enemies of science. You're the enemy. Because you not only want to introduce Darwin into the curriculum, you want to talk us out of our religion. There can be no possible reconciliation. Now, you know, I agree that, you know, Christianity in any very traditional sense, and Islam in any very traditional sense, is not reconcilable with modern knowledge, including critical knowledge about the history of these religions.
Well, what to do about that when knowledge counts? I mean, when people have to decide what diseases to cure and how to cure them.
If one of your main goals, if you're in Kansas and you really want Darwin in the curriculum, I would say you can take comfort in the fact that Christians and Muslims and all kinds of other people can be remarkably good at just not thinking the thing through clearly. That's like, you know, they can just say natural selection is consistent with Christianity. Now, my own view is, if you really, the more you think about it, the less clear that is, at least any traditional version of Christianity. But the fact is, there are millions of people who, as long as you don't grab them by lapels and say, you don't understand, your faith is inconsistent with Darwin being in the curriculum, they'll let it go. Right. And, and that's another pragmatic question. I haven't done research in this area, but this is a real concern of people, and I just raise it.
Okay, well, I have a strong intuition that there are no faiths that are best exemplified by the people who are in the process of losing faith. I mean, it's very easy to point to Christians and Muslims and Jews and people of any faith who don't take their faith very seriously. Now, that is all to the good. But what do we credit that transformation to? Faiths, to one or another degree, have all collided with modernity. They've all collided with the scientific worldview. The progress of medicine is the clearest example. There are still some communities where if your child is having a seizure one morning, your first thought is demonic possession, but they are precious few in the West. Now, in Africa, demonic possession is a going concern. There are kids who are tortured as witches. There are killed as witches. We from the outside look into these societies, and much of this hysteria is being stoked by Christian ministers, actually. This is clearly no place worth going. This is something we have outgrown based on very specific ideas. The germ theory of disease, basic understanding of neurology, that has just wiped clean certain ecclesiastical roles. You don't go to the priest and find out what's wrong with your child when he or she is exhibiting symptoms of physical disease in the West now. Again, there are a few startling exceptions, but there are exceptions that reveal that we have made huge gains. At each point, to make those gains now and to keep them, to keep the conquered ground, we have to repudiate specific religious ideas. When the person shows up at the neurologist saying, I'm still thinking it might be demonic possession, so there's a conversation there that has to be had. And there's a conversation that has to be had at the level of public policy. I mean, what do you do to a parent whose religious conviction just led them to deny their child medical care or to smother their child in the process of performing an exorcism? This happens in the United States occasionally. We have to absolutely repudiate the religious ideas that account for that behavior, and to some significant degree we do. But again, those gains are hard won. And they now are not enforced by being tactful on those specific points. And I'm just saying that we are getting to a time where it's like the world is getting way too small for us to just wait and see how bad the idea of God can get.
We seem to agree about demonic possession. It's rarely a powerful explanation of human behavior. Yeah, so harmony. We have harmony. We've achieved harmony. I don't know. Should we? What should we do? Should I try to antagonize him further? This is a total between the two of us.
What's between? We have
4 minutes.
Okay. Is there a Q&A section here? Maybe we should add that to the Q&A. I think that would be more productive.
Hello? Yeah. My name is Sadasivam. This question is for Mr. Wright. In answering a question of Mr. Sam Harris about you attributed to the political problems and the social problems was the reason for the decline of the Arabic literature and other things.
Of what?
Arabic literature, the rise of or the decline of the Arabic literacy or Arabic contribution to science, you attribute it to social problems and then political problems. But what I hear from Ibn Waraq's book and other scholars, it started well before 9th, 10th century, where Arabic contribution to science and astronomy was at its great. At that time period, where all the religious mullahs and others protested and discouraged any of those reasoning and inquiry and reasoning in their day-to-day life and in their religion. Mm-hmm. So that is the beginning of the Islamic decline or in contribution to any of the world science progress. But now, with knowing that, now we are seeing a new phase, as Mr. Harris says, with this kind of jihadism and the others not willing to tell the Islamic world about this. Why don't we? No, that's a question. That's a question.
Okay.
That's a question. So don't we have to be more outright in condemning rather than conforming to them, so that from 100 years from now, as Mr. Sam Harris says, there may be a nuclear terrorism? That's my question, your answer.
I mean, first, if I understood the first part of your question, has to do with the failure of Islamic civilization to keep up in terms of science and technology in kind of the early modern period with Europe. I personally, in general, don't buy kind of explanations of these things that appeal to the religious doctrines in the relative societies. My pet theory there is that Western Europe had the advantage of being broken up, of not being an empire, broken up into a number of competing nation states, which kind of forced them to adopt the norms that were most conducive to economic efficiency and productivity. So I don't buy the religious determinist explanation of that. If you were asking me about condemning things, I'm all for condemning some stuff like terrorism. I don't know. I'm not sure. What more you're asking actually. So I don't know.
Yeah, Michael Dowd here. One of the things that it seems to me is that I take an ecosystems view, that I think we need my sense is that the new atheists need to be doing what they're doing. They need to be hitting religion, especially supernatural otherworldlyism, really hard. We also need people taking an accommodating stance, a bridge-building stance. I'm curious, is there anything that either, because I'm aware that both of you probably share 98% of your sort of, as been talked about before, your sort of mimetic DNA. Can either of you say something positive about the other's position?
You go first.
I think you've given me the harder job. Well, I'm not, again, I'm sorry to say, I'm not entirely sure what your position is, even though I've just debated you. It seems to me that you want to doubt that religious beliefs are ever truly operative. And are ever the real explanation for completely unnecessary causes of human misery. And I just think when you think about how beliefs operate in the world and see what people do in the service of various ideas, there's no reason to doubt that. And we only become very tactful on the subject of religion. But when you look at racism. Racism as an ideology. Why did the Third Reich decide to kill the Jews? Now, this conveniently for my purposes, this actually has something to do with the history of religion. But let's say it didn't. You read Mein Kampf. Hitler hated Jews. Okay, did his hatred of Jews have something to do with what happened? Does his belief about the inferiority of the Jews and the threat of Judaism in German society have something to do with what happened? Clearly, these ideas have power, and I just don't see how you can doubt that religious ideas have that power. They have more power than any other ideas. These are the ideas that allow people to watch their kids sacrifice their lives and celebrate it. And so it's.
Sam, unless I'm mistaken, you've just failed to say something positive about me.
I did. Yeah.
And I've already said that you're a better meditator than me, so I win, as I understand it.
But to the question, I will acknowledge that people have different roles to play, and never for a moment do I imagine that everyone should be speaking in the way I speak about Islam or any other religion in every context. That clearly would get lots of people killed.
Hi, my name is Todd Stiefel. My question is for Robert Wright. And I heard you say several times that you feel it is counterproductive to criticize religion. And I was trying desperately to figure out why you feel that way. And the best answer I heard from you was that they become intracted and push back. And to me, that does not seem like a very valid reason to not push, because of course they're going to push back. So I was wondering if you have any better reasons why we shouldn't criticize religion.
I wouldn't say it's always counterproductive to criticize religion. I've just noticed with fundamentalists in general that it seems to be counterproductive. I mean, I think, Karen Armstrong's thesis is that fundamentalism tends to arise from a sense of threat, and often it's a threat to the culture you've inherited, the values you cherish. And if that's true, and I think it largely is, then you would expect that the more they feel they're under attack, the more fundamentalists they come. So I'm not saying you shouldn't feel free to do what you want. I'm saying I think often it winds up being counterproductive. Even if your goal is to hasten the day when there is no religious faith, if you look at, there are a lot more people in America today who really don't believe, including people who go to Episcopalian churches and stuff. There are a lot more people who, when push comes to shove, you ask them, do you really believe there's God? They say no. Almost none of these people were kind of browbeaten into it, by people kind of grabbing them by the lapels. It just kind of fades away. And I'm suggesting that even if your goal is for religion to fade away, it may be faster to just let it fade away. That may just be the empirical fact. I'm not sure, but that's a possibility.
Alex Gelbard, and Bob, you had mentioned over the weekend, I've heard the term new atheist. Why don't you just call yourselves born-again atheists? That'd be one of the questions. The other question is, in relationship to 20 years of waiting for homosexuals, gays, lesbians to have equal rights, that's not acceptable. And the question I have for both of you is, well, the other statement I wanted to make is, I don't feel that there is any peaceful religion. And the question is, what can we do rather than be on the high level, on the bottom level where we can all participate in trying to affect some type of change in this country?
You think there is a peaceful religion, Jainism, right?
Well, I mean, there clearly, yes, there are. Again, the religion is a term so vague and misleading as to be worse than useless when we're actually having this conversation, because it allows Bob to not face the specific consequences of specific ideas that are central to specific faiths. So, for instance, you said, let's not criticize it, and let's it's counterproductive. What do you do with a belief like death in defense of Islam is the best thing that can happen to a person? That is a belief that is not a fringe belief in the Muslim world. It's not the 5% of Muslims who think that's true.
Well, almost none of them act on it.
Yeah, okay, but
sure.
again, you have sort of concentric circles where there are those who act, there are those who support those who act, there are those who are further still, but still believe martyrdom is actually true, and will tolerate no criticism of the faith. I mean, the numbers of people who think you should be killed for drawing a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad, it's going to be in the hundreds of millions in the Muslim world. It's not going to be 50,000 people. I mean, this is a huge civilizational problem. And so with specific beliefs like that, if you're not criticizing them, then you're enabling them. I don't see the. I really don't. You have to hold the line on all of these points, or bad ideas inherit the earth.
Ben Wallison from Boston University. So, Sam, I'm a neuroscientist like you, a member of the Society for Neuroscience. And what I was actually really kind of very upset to hear the Islamic bashing.
You're upset?
Upset.
Yeah.
I think what's going on now is terrible. But I think as a neuroscientist, you have a much stronger ability to generalize. And I would like to hear you talk about some of your words. I download your book. I'm reading it. In more general context, because we know humans are aggressive. That's a reality, and we form teams. And Tutsis kill Hutus. German Nazis killed Jews. Cambodians killed people. The Christian Crusaders killed people. And it's going to happen in the future, in the past. And I think when I read your book, my sense is that you're kind of thinking of the well-being as the collective kind of activity of our dopamine systems, if you want to simplify it too much.
Yeah.
And, the amygdala were a bit too active. We killed off the Neanderthals. Can't you generalize your work instead of, for us right now, one of the big issues is extremism. We, as a species, are very prone to extremism, and with that comes in a kind of dehumanizing the other, and
right.
We're all capable of that. There are lots of experiments that show that even in this room, under certain circumstances, a fraction of us would do things that that others would consider inhuman.
Sure.
So, can't you generalize what you're saying? For the audience, and try to make it not just this decade, but this century.
Well, again, apologies for the narrow focus on Islam. It was not actually what I was planning to speak about tonight, but it seemed to be the channel we went down. But I also wasn't planning to give a summary of a book tour talk because that doesn't seem appropriate. But briefly, I can say that, I think the challenge for us is there's this great myth that the most important questions in human life, questions of what constitutes a good life, how should we raise our children, what does it mean to be good, what is well-being, questions of right and wrong and good and evil, these are questions that science can never get a handle on. And so what I'm doing in my book is trying to deflate that myth. I think it's a genuine myth. I think there are fallacies of reasoning that prop it up. There's some bad philosophy that everyone has memorized in the scientific community, which drives this intuition that you can never get an ought from an is, for instance. And so it seems obvious to me that if you believe that the scientific understanding of the mind is going to mature, which I think it will, then everything we want out of life, positive social emotions, compassion, trust, all of this is something we will understand to a greater degree through our growing understanding of the human mind. And there will be right and wrong answers, and there clearly are right and wrong answers to the question of how to raise compassionate children. And these are answers that can be understood at every level, from the genome on up to economic systems. I mean, everything that can possibly influence states of the human brain. Genetics and neurobiology and psychology and sociology, every level of description. And clearly these are facts that fall within the purview of science. Now, we don't need any more data from science, and we certainly don't need a completed neuroscience to know that burning the faces off of little girls with battery acid for the crime of learning to read is a bad practice. We know that is one of the many wrong answers to the question of how to live a good life. And it's nothing unscientific about saying that, and yet there's this bias that there's no place to stand within science where we can judge the Taliban. And I'm saying that to not judge the Taliban from the point of view of science is tantamount to saying we know absolutely nothing about human well-being. And we'll never know anything about human well-being. And it's not intellectually honest, and it is a failure of compassion that we are culpable for.
Can I just quickly say something that I think is a little responsive?
Just ask you to respond.
Well, just quickly, I do think that the problem is not religion, it's tribalism, it's groupishness, and we all are more prone to that than we realize. I mean, I fight it all the time, that I think is somewhat in the spirit of your question. And the previous questioner said, there's no such thing as a peaceful religion. Well, there's probably no such thing as an eternally peaceful people either. I mean, there are people right now who are rightly worried about Chinese nationalism, which is a real force, believe me, that the Chinese government is worried about. That's not an especially religious country. But that could become a problem. And I think all of us in our everyday lives, whatever tribe you belong to, we all belong to some tribes, and you have to be careful. Some of you belong to the New Atheist tribe, and it's easy.
That's not fair. It's way too facile. There are these sort of tricks of language, scientific fundamentalism. Okay? It's a nonsense term, and yet it's continually hurled at us, and Richard gets it more than anyone. It's just not true. There is no analogous groupishness to atheism.
Actually,
yes, there just isn't. First of all, I didn't even use the word atheist in the End of Faith. I mean, I never even thought of myself as an atheist, and I wrote that book. It's just not a variable that is operative the way any religion is.
I will say this may or may not be relevant to what you're saying. I think it's not totally irrelevant. My book, The Evolution of God, could have antagonized almost anyone who read it closely. Certainly Christians, Jews, and Muslims, if they were believing Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and to some extent atheists, because I have argued that I think there's reason to believe that there's some larger purpose at work, not in a spooky mystical sense, but in the sense that a material system like the physical universe can have purpose. Anyway, so I got, various kinds of hate email, and you would have expected it to be most hateful from the Christians, because I wasn't just saying, Jesus wasn't the Son of God or anything. I was saying, and I wasn't doing the usual thing of saying, okay, wasn't the Son of God, but he said all this wonderful stuff. I said he didn't even say the wonderful stuff, in my view. I think that was attributed to him later, after he died. And so you'd expect that I'd get a lot of hate email from Christians, but I got to say, on balance, the atheists were nastier. I think that's not insignificant. There was more hostility, and that's just I just throw that out there for possible reflection.
I was wondering, do you have any comments on the kind of pernicious effects of kind of the symbiosis of the rising Christianity in Africa and the religious right in America? I know Sarah Palin, just to call out one name, but she's really only the tip of the iceberg. And Africa, kind of its issues with birth control, AIDS prevention, increasing kind of violence between Christians and Muslims, and also recently interfering at the encouragement, is my understanding, of Christian fundamentalists here with paleontologists trying to do work in Africa.
Was that directed to one of us, or? Well, to keep it short, obviously it's terrifying and disturbing, and clearly it's an example of religious ideas in action. I mean, no one goes to Africa preaching the divinity of Jesus and the evils of contraception in villages decimated by AIDS unless believing the dogma of, in this case, the Christian or Catholic Church. I mean, it's just, ideas have consequences, and you don't find people working with Doctors Without Borders doing that. You find Christian missionaries doing that, and it's not an accident. And to not oppose these ideas with great energy simply allows them to have free reign.
Yeah, I mean, I agree it's a problem. There's another problem with Christians is some of the aggressive proselytizing they do in Africa to Muslims. Muslims find very threatening and react very adversely to. Both of those are problems, to some extent driven by the religious beliefs of Christians. And I don't deny that religious beliefs matter. Again, I said that from the beginning. And
but you keep taking it away. In the next breath, you seem to discount the role of religion in any of the big consequential moments. I mean,
I'm not always saying that. Sometimes I'm just saying that the thing that is most amenable to manipulation by us are the underlying material forces that will ultimately reshape the beliefs. I would say, though, that there are also a lot of missionaries, they're probably more likely to be Catholic than Protestant, who are just out there, doing God's work, so to speak. They're not trying to convert people. They're just out there trying to help people who need help. And if you're going to chalk up the good and bad of religion, that deserves to be in the ledger.
Okay, first question. Do you all mind if I don't ask a question about Islam?
Please.
My name is Robin. I'm from Nebraska, and I want to address the comment that Robert Wright brought up a couple of times and ask him about this, that religion overall is neutral. He talks about it does some good, it does some bad. So I want to ask you, okay, you've got a woman, say, goes for 10 years to a soup kitchen. Obviously, this is good. She's doing good. She's going to her church and feeding the poor. She goes home, and because of what she believes religiously, and for no other reason, she beats her children. And her children spend 10 years in therapy to match the 10 years in her soup kitchen. Therefore, we have one really good thing, the soup kitchen, that maybe she wouldn't have done if she were not religious, or maybe she would have. And the 10 years in therapy, then those become neutral. And it sounds to me like that's what you're saying, that these would be equal and balance each other out, because it's been good and it's been bad. But there's a lot of us, and a lot of us in this room, that are carrying very, very deep scars over it that we may have carried around our whole life, that may find it a little harder to see that neutrality. Can you address that?
Well, that would be part of the bad. I mean, to say that there are good and bad expressions of anything is not to deny the depth of the bad. I'm not sure I understand.
I guess
what
what
you're
I'm
asking
saying
beyond
is,
that.
are the scars of a small child or millions of small children then being weighed out by whatever this good is? And does it matter if it was possible that that good could possibly have been done without religion?
It's possible the good and the bad could have been done without religion. Certainly people have been known to beat their children for reasons other than religion, and I think sometimes people justify things they do with reference to religion when in fact they'd be doing them anyway. I don't purport to be able to settle the question, first of all, of whether more good or bad has been done. It seems to me kind of a close call. It's a very difficult question, but I don't deny the bad or how bad feels, you know.
Were you brought up religious?
Yeah, I was brought up Southern Baptist.
Because, like I said, for some of us, it's going to be very hard to get there.
Yeah.
Go on to the next question, please.
I've got a feeling this question's for me, but maybe I'm wrong.
I want to ask Robert Wright a question as an enthusiast for game theory. The preamble is your statement that religion is not so important as tribalism and groupishness, and I want to plant in your mind the idea that of the various badges by which groups might recognize in-group and out-group, religion might be more important than most because of the power of religious faith, which is handed on from generation to generation. Now, here's the game theory question. A thought experiment in a country that we might as well call Northern Ireland. Imagine that 300 years ago, you'd set up an experiment in which you divided people into two different tribes, which have no difference at all, but we'll call them the blues and the greens.
Mm-hmm.
And the rules are only these. Blues have to marry blues, greens have to marry greens, and blue children go to blue schools, and green children go to green schools. And that's going to go on for 300 years. As a game theorist, what is your prediction 300 years later, when the blues have never intermarried with the blues and the greens never with the greens, and they've gone to separate schools and learned separate things, learned separate interpretations of history, which have gradually grown up? You know as a game theorist what you're going to predict is going to happen. What will be the tribalisms that you will see in 300 years' time? And would you expect violence?
Actually, if disparities emerged in the course of the history between the two groups in terms of power, socioeconomic standing, relative income levels, which would give rise to possible resentments, and various other things, I would think it's actually possible that antagonism could develop. And I don't know much about Northern Ireland, but as I understand it, Catholics and Protestants were not equal in all of those respects and in their access to power.
That may very well be true, but my point is, how do you know which tribe you belong to unless you've been to a Catholic school or a Protestant school? If they'd simply intermarried and gone to the same schools, you wouldn't be able to identify who's a Catholic or a Protestant. There'd be no such thing as a Catholic or a Protestant.
Right.
The world would be a better place.
Yeah, well, the context for this is in a way something you've elaborated on since I think you wrote the thing that I criticized about Israel and Palestine. I actually have the quote here. I won't read the whole thing, but the upshot is you say, do I really think that Northern Ireland was about theology? Of course, no. Theology is the last thing on the minds. You're saying religious belief per se, in a sense, is not the issue. They're not killing because of religion, because of political grievances, often justified. They are killing because the other lot killed their fathers, or because the other lot drove their great-grandfathers off their land, so on. You're basically saying that even so, religion can be dangerous because it's a marker. It's kind of ethnic marker. And I think you're right. Now, I would say that That doesn't work for the Israel-Palestine claim because there were plenty of ethnic markers, they spoke different languages, and so on. So I think it stands that that would have been a conflict in any event. But you know, I take your point that markers in general can be kind of dangerous, and it may be that in some, you know, I think in a lot of cases the religious marker has overlay with linguistic, with ethnic, and so on. So there might be conflict anyway. You've chosen an example where it may be that there wouldn't be. That's certainly possible. You know, and bad if true. That is a quite different claim from that's a very different kind of concern from the kind of concern that we've heard generally from the new atheists, which is that it really is about religious belief per se and theological difference per se. In fact, Northern Ireland offers an interesting counterexample to that claim, because you know, you might think, well, okay, Catholics and Protestants, they have their issues with each other, but when it comes to Muslims, surely they would unite on theological grounds, right? They both believe Jesus is the Son of God. Actually, I'm told that if you look at Catholic neighborhoods in Northern Ireland, you will find in many windows the Palestinian flag. Okay? They see some Muslims that they identify with, and the reason is that they see their socioeconomic condition as equivalent. So, I take your point, and I don't deny that religion can sometimes be bad in that sense, in the sense that any kind of ethnic or group marker is. It's kind of a different argument from what we've been hearing.
Yeah. Well, let me just throw in my 2 cents here, because I think you sort of let yourself off the hook here.
I was certainly hoping to.
Clearly, there are situations in which religion is operative as a marker differentiating two groups, but it's not actually the direct cause of the conflict. There's clannishness, there's vendetta, there's the history of violence, but there are clearly situations in which religion is the explicit cause of the violence. I mean, there are Sunni in Pakistan at this moment blowing up Shia mosques and blowing up Sufi mosques and blowing up Ahmadi mosques, and it is based on the idea that these people are apostates.
That's what they say, but there are also often in these cases clear-cut socioeconomic differences.
At the beginning of this debate, you conceded that your analysis was powerless to account for the 19 hijackers. At least there were 19 people who really believed what they said they believed.
No, I didn't say it was powerless. I didn't say a materialistic account is powerless.
Okay,
I said the three factors that you had cited in your book could not account.
So it's not economics, it's not education, it's not opportunity, it's not a history of oppression. None of these guys connect any of those dots. These are all college-educated guys living in Europe, free to do what they want to do. Some of them were married. They thought the best thing they could do was hit the wall at 400 miles an hour and kill 3,000 infidels.
I wouldn't say there's no economics involved. No, but should we re-adjudicate this or just?
I think we should continue the questions. As we say, we're almost actually at the 30-minute mark, but I'll allow 5 more questions, 5 more questioners.
I'm sorry to interrupt this dialogue. As James H.D. from the Blue Oasis in the red state of Texas. Sam had mentioned truth. Diogenes, the original cynic, said that one of his tasks was to parakaraten ton nomisma, to invalidate, delegitimize, destabilize the currency. That has been the task for several hundred years of what's called historical critical scholarship as an ally to science and reason in undermining the beliefs that people have. We didn't talk much tonight about Judeo-Christian tradition, but a lot of that progress has been made against some resistance in the West. And if even Warrock had been here, he might be able to give us an idea of how it might proceed a little more gingerly, probably slowly, in the East. I wondered if either of you wanted to comment on the possibility of a via media, a third way, using critical scholarship to ask people where they got their beliefs. Most of their beliefs came from incompetent teachers who didn't know Hebrew, who didn't know Greek, who didn't know Aramaic, or any of the subjects that would be required to talk about God or Jesus or heaven. Any comments, please?
Well, briefly, I would say that yes, there has not been a tradition of textual criticism in the Muslim world because it's anathema, because the Quran is viewed as literal Word of God in a way that the Bible, frankly, isn't, even among fundamentalist Christians and Orthodox Jews. The Quran has a different status, and there are some efforts to do this now. Richard and I have actually funded a conference that organized by Ibn Warwick in Germany, subjecting the Quran to textual criticism. A lot of these guys have to run around with pseudonyms because they fear for their lives in Germany. And this is, Christopher Luxemburg, a pseudonym, the guy who announced to the world, to the amusement of everyone, that the word in Arabic for virgin, hur, probably meant white raisins. And so we imagine, the suicide bombers getting to paradise and getting a fistful of raisins. Amusing, but he lives in hiding based on that scholarship. He's a scholar of Semitic languages. That's central to the war of ideas that has to be prosecuted. There has to be an analysis of religious texts. And what you find when you analyze them closely is that they betray their human authorship in every line. And that's a rather seditious thing to do, and I wish we should support the effort.
Hi, I'm Steve from Wisconsin, and I wonder if you could both comment briefly on what I see as a major threat from mainstream Christianity. I know Catholics, very reasonable people who are hoping seriously for the end times, and I never thought of Catholicism, I'm a former Catholic, as being that fundamental or extreme.
Yeah. Well, any credence given to biblical or Quranic prophecy, I think, is terrifying. So to the degree to which people believe these things should worry us. Now, we all take refuge in the fact that it just seems very difficult to believe that anyone actually believes this stuff. And I think we sleep more peacefully at night imagining that no one really believes what they say they believe. But I actually think a significant percentage of Christians in the United States, if you trust the polls, it's something like 45%. Let's cut that in half. I mean, the 22% actually say they're sure Jesus is going to come in their lifetime and rapture them. Not just sometime in their lifetime. So 22%, it's already a figure far higher than we would want. And in the Muslim world, the problem is of another scope entirely. And it interacts with politics. So you have liberals who say Hamas is the democratically elected government of the Palestinians. Israel has to deal with them. Well, the charter of Hamas says that history will not be fulfilled until the rocks and trees cry out, "There's a Jew behind me, come kill him." In the founding document of the government. Okay, so it's no wonder that the Israelis think they're dealing with religious sociopaths. I mean, there has to be a way to deflate these myths, and prophecy is a huge concern.
I mean, I would add, I'm told that if you read the charter of the Likud party, you would think that a two-state solution is completely hopeless, and yet we are asking Palestinians to deal with the Likud government precisely on that question. So if charters are determinative, then there is indeed no hope.
My name's Jeff. I live in Brooklyn, and I just have a comment. No, I'm just kidding. But I just was hoping, yes, Bob, you could comment, and Sam, on how meditation can increase human well-being. I know you've both been to the Insight Meditation Society, I think, so.
I have. Great. And you've seen the bond between us that has been fostered by that.
You want to take that? Or
I'm happy to take it. I mean, I'm like the world's worst meditator by nature. I had tried to meditate, and finally, I had to go to one of these retreats where you just don't talk for a week, and you just are forced to meditate intensely every day. It had a completely transformative effect. At the end of it, my wife was just delighted with the new me. The new me lasted, 72 hours maybe. I've been to a few of these retreats. When I do keep up the practice afterward, The effects can, in moderate form, last a little longer. But one thing I'm really serious about is that the state of mind I was in at the end of these things is just much closer to the truth, I think. Because one thing you are divorced of is exactly the blinders we've kind of been alluding to, that, yes, can be manifested in religious tribalism, in other forms of tribalism, but just the tendency to view things from your own perspective and implicitly belittle the significance or perspective of everyone whose interests seem to contradict with yours. I think that is a kind of blindness inflicted on us by natural selection for its own reasons, because it was good for the genes. The fact that it was good for the genes, A, doesn't mean it's good for us now. B, doesn't mean it aligns with actual moral truth. So that brief period when I was, closer to enlightenment was very gratifying. Now, Sam, I think, stays in a nearly constant state of enlightenment, and maybe would like to comment on that.
Well, we agree about the significance of meditation, but ironically, my experience in meditation gives my criticism of religion more motivation, because it's patently obvious to me that these states of mind, which I think are closer to the truth, I think it's possible to discover through various methodologies a way of being in the world that is less neurotic and less self-concerned and more compassionate and freer than you have been tending to discover based on the mayhem of your own distraction. So that meditation is a tool for doing that. But there's absolutely nothing that one has to believe on insufficient evidence to explore that. And that's what is such a travesty that's why faith is such a travesty. And that's why belief-based religion, this idea that you have to lie to yourself or to your children about the nature of reality, is such an egregious way of missing the mark. And so I think meditation and the contemplative life would be part of any maturing scientific understanding of the human mind, and it's something I'm very interested in.
My name is Claire. I'm from Los Angeles, and my question is for Robert Wright. You said that the tactics of the new atheists are unproductive and perhaps even counterproductive. How would you respond to someone like me who has been converted by the new atheists and wouldn't have access to this community if they hadn't spoken out?
I think that's good. You don't strike me as somebody who was on the path to suicide bombing before they converted you. I'm not belittling the significance of the conversion. If it's made you happier, that's great. But what I said was, the irony is that the people you're most likely to successfully convert are the people who aren't the problem. That doesn't mean, the people who aren't the problem we're talking about, which is radical fundamentalism in the world. That doesn't mean it's not good that it happened. And I've got to say that, the success of books like Sam's and Richard's has kind of opened my eyes to how many people must have felt in communities across America, maybe, that they were oppressed, that they couldn't speak out about their skepticism. And that kind of surprised me because, I went to high school in San Antonio, which isn't exactly Manhattan. And, I used to go around saying I was an atheist, and I didn't get any blowback or anything. I was kind of a source of, an interesting, I was kind of exotic, but I stand corrected in having assumed that this was not an issue. It is an issue, apparently, that people either suffer from being in the closet as unbelievers, or are kind of believing and would be happier and feel liberated if they didn't.
Yeah. Well, very briefly on that point, let me just say I have the fact that I hear from readers has given me a window onto a world that I would never be aware of through my own experience. And I hear from people who have literally never met anyone in their life who has ever confessed the slightest doubt about God. And they are sure that they will be ostracized if they breathe a word of their doubts. And they are atheists. And their parents will disown them, their friends will disown them. I mean, everyone is in a cult. Everyone who's in a serious religious community is in a cult that they don't, if they're at all isolated, if they're not living on the coasts, they don't see an obvious way of getting out of. And that's, there's definitely a role to be played in publicly criticizing these communities from afar and announcing another possibility to people.
All right, so I guess I get the last question.
Yeah, this will be the last question of the evening.
Interesting coincidence. My name is Dr. Richard Carrier. I'm a native Californian. Yeah. My name is Dr. Richard Carrier, and I'm a native Californian. And my question is for Dr. Wright. You said that the confrontational approach doesn't work. I think that was almost an exact quote. That's a testable hypothesis, and I'm actually going to test it right now. I need audience participation. We're going to do a scientific experiment, so for a scientific experiment to be accurate, I need everybody to participate. Don't be shy. I know some people are shy about raising their hands. How many people here, by a show of hands, are now an unbeliever, but were once a fundamentalist believer? Let's see your hands. Somewhat. Now keep your hands up, please. Now, if the answer to my next question is yes, then lower your hand. My next question is, was your deconversion at least in part caused by contact with confrontational atheist literature or arguments? If the answer is yes, lower your hand. So we got about, how was that? About 1/3, 2/3 lowered? Look pretty similar. Let's do that again. Let's get the hands, all converts, get up. Yeah, it was more than half. Okay, and lower your hand if your deconversion was at least partly caused by contact with confrontational atheist literature or arguments. All right, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, so it's definitely more than half. So it's not ineffectual, right?
Apparently in some cases it would not. I would emphasize that I think a lot of factors come into play here. For example, does the message come from a culture that you already consider the enemy? And I would also say that, fundamentalist is a pretty, like evangelical, a pretty fuzzy term. I mean, the fundamentalists we're most concerned about are the people who have the potential to be violent. And I was thinking largely about the ones in the Muslim world. And I'm suggesting, I don't have any empirical evidence of this because, this is a really hard study to do, but I'm suggesting that in the Islamic world, the fundamentalists you would be most concerned about are absolutely not going to be swayed in the direction you'd like by a confrontational approach from an American. That's a very strong intuition of mine, but, I can see that's all it can be. It is based on a certain amount of experience with American fundamentalists whom I've actually seen recoil in the face of confrontation.
Yeah, but we have plenty of evidence of people who don't, who eventually are converted. My point is, it looks to me like you're saying you agree with Sam Harris on just about every possible case of deconversion except for extreme, radical, violent, suicidal people. Because it seems like you're really obsessed with the suicide bomber thing. We're concerned about gay bashing. We're concerned about gay rights. We're concerned about health care.
Fine.
I mean, if we can convert those people to secular humanism through confrontationalism, we ought to do it. Yes?
Yeah, we didn't talk about that tonight, and I'd be happy to talk about it sometime. And Sam said maybe we shouldn't have gotten so focused on Islam, and maybe we shouldn't have. But that was absolutely the context of what I was talking about. I do think you find fundamentalists of many kinds, often recoiling, but you're right. We were not talking about domestic American politics and social issues. Maybe we should have, but my remarks were in the context. And my criticisms of the new atheists have only been in two contexts. One is the kind of educational agenda, the Kansas question, but my bigger concern is precisely the so-called war on terror, and that's what that's what I was talking about.
Okay, yeah. Well, we have a lot of other.
I absolutely I respect that.